Campaigning has drawn to a close in Mexico ahead of elections on Sunday. People will cast their ballots for a new president, and they'll choose local lawmakers, mayors, and council members. It will be the biggest ever election in Mexico's history, ending a campaign that has been Mexico's most violent. A flurry of last-minute campaigning was accompanied by, as we said, a lot of violence. On Thursday, gunmen shot dead a mayoral candidate in the southern state of Guerrero. Alfredo Cabrera was at a campaign rally when he was approached and shot several times at point-blank range. His death brought the number of politicians who have been murdered in Mexico in this campaign to at least 24. Well, my next guest is known for his expertise and insider experience in U.S. politics. David Frum was a speechwriter for the late President George W. Bush, credited with that famous phrase, axis of evil. I should say George W. Bush, not the father. And he is now senior editor at The Atlantic. All right, let's talk about Mexico. You've written a lot about Mexican politics and democracy. As we reported, about 24 candidates for various offices have been assassinated in the campaign, the run-up to this weekend's election. What condition is democracy south of the border in at this moment?
Situation is quite dire, and I'm not an expert on Mexico, but I was very involved with work in the Bush White House at the beginning of Mexico's transition to multi-party democracy, and we now seem to be at the end, on its way back to the single-party rule that characterized Mexico in much of the 20th century. You mentioned the violence in this election. Mm-hmm. The past 6 years of the tenure of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador have been the most violent 6 years in Mexico's modern history. I think you have to go back to the Mexican Revolution of almost a century ago to find anything comparable, or a century ago to find anything comparable to what has been happening now. Probably 180,000 people violently dead over the past 6 years, 112,000 or so who have just vanished with no trace. And this has aptly been described as a criminal insurgency. This is not just ordinary crime, not just gangs. These are near governments extracting resources from people, offering a kind of protection in return for those resources, controlling wide parts of Mexican territory. And now they're having an election in which a president who has done tremendous damage to subvert Mexico's democratic institutions, the independent judiciary, the electoral commission, is looking to install his handpicked successor, whom he's recruited. It's impressive that she's a woman. It's impressive that she's of different background. She'll be the first. She's of Jewish origin on both her father's and mother's side first. But she has chosen above all for her lack of any political strength, for her complete dependence on President López Obrador, and he hopes to continue to rule through her.
Can we say then, or can Mexicans say that this election on Sunday will be free and fair?
I think it will be free, but not fair. If you are able to get to the polls and you cast a vote, I think that vote will be counted honestly. But there's a lot more violence in areas where the government is weak than in areas where the government is strong. And so you may not be able to get to the polls. And many of the rules about the Mexican electoral system, very complicated rules to respond to past abuses, those have not been enforced equally on all the parties. So this election I would describe as free, but not fair. Mm-hmm. The next election, worse than that.
I think it was last year you wrote in an article that had the headline, Mexico is incubating an autocrat next door. An autocrat in Mexico. I mean, would a second Donald Trump term in Washington, would that be just what the autocrat in Mexico had ordered? I mean, would these two systems suddenly complement each other?
Donald Trump and López Obrador had a very close and functional relationship, which gives the lie, I think, to this. There's a kind of glib description of López Obrador as a man of the left and Donald Trump as a man of the right. But in fact, they have much more in common. And the deal they sort of struck was Trump wanted less migration from Mexico, and he didn't care how Mexico stopped it, and he wanted fewer Chinese auto parts in Mexican cars. And if López Obrador gave him those things, and he did, then Trump would look the other way as López Obrador took apart Mexican democracy. And unfortunately, that deal has more or less continued in the Biden years. President Biden's Mexico policy bears a lot of points of resemblance to Donald Trump's. He also has not done a lot to safeguard Mexican democracy. And now we're going to have the possibility of a president extending his term through the informal means of controlling his weak successor.
We've got about 40 seconds left. I just want to ask you, if you were advising the president right now, what would you advise him? What's the first thing he should do when the election results are announced in Mexico?
America's options are very limited because of the often sad history between the United States and Mexico. American words often land badly on Mexican ears, but he needs to understand that Mexican democracy needs to be a priority, not just migration, not just trade, democracy too.
David Frum, David, we appreciate you taking the time, sharing your insights, your experience, especially on this Friday. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.